The land was a study in browns and golds, a vast, unforgiving canvas under a sky so wide and blue it seemed to press down on the world, bleaching the color from everything it touched. Dust, fine as powdered bone, settled on the sparse, hardy grass that clung to life in stubborn clumps. The wind was a constant presence, a dry, whispering voice that carried the scent of sun-baked earth and distant sage. It was a place that demanded resilience, that stripped a man down to his essentials and left no room for softness. In the center of this immensity sat Rhett Corrigan's ranch, a solitary outpost against the horizon. The house was built of thick, hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and straw, its roof weathered to a silver gray. A sturdy barn, a corral, and a well house stood nearby, all arranged with a pragmatist's eye for efficiency and defense. This was not a home. It was a fortification. It was Rhett's world, built with the same deliberate, unyielding strength he carried in his own bones. Rhett moved through this world with the economy of a man who wasted nothing, not a motion, not a word, not a thought. The war had burned away all that was superfluous. It had left him with a quiet intensity, a habit of watching the horizon, and a network of fine white scars on his hands, and one that traced the sharp line of his jaw. He was a man made of straight lines and hard angles, his face weathered by the sun and his eyes the color of a stormy sky. He lived by a simple, rigid code. Work was to be done, promises were to be kept, and justice, in its rawest form, was the only law that mattered. His solitude was not born of misanthropy, but of a deep-seated weariness with the noise and compromise of the world beyond his fences. Here, there was only the earth, the sky, and the silent understanding between him and the animals in his care. His days were a litany of chores, a rhythm that soothed the unquiet parts of his soul. He rose before the sun painted the eastern sky, his first task to check the well, its depth a constant measure of life or death in this arid country. He mended fences, his hands sure and practiced as he stretched the wire taut. His mind focused on the simple, honest task. He spoke more to his horse, a stoic buckskin named Pilgrim, than he did to any human in the town of Redemption. A day's ride east, Pilgrim understood the language of a gentle hand and a firm command. And that was all the companionship Rhett required. Yet, a man could not live on silence alone. The winters were long, the silence growing heavy and cold, seeping into the logs of the house itself. The thought of another one, alone, had finally gnawed through his resolve. And so, he had done what many lonely men on the frontier did. He had written a letter. He was mucking out the barn, the familiar scent of hay and horse filling the air. When he saw the dust cloud in the distance, it was the mail rider, a wiry youth who pushed his horse hard and valued speed over conversation. Rhett leaned on his pitchfork, watching the rider approach. A flicker of something, not quite excitement, but a quiet anticipation stirring in his chest. The boy reined in his lathered horse, passed over a single, slim envelope, and accepted the canteen of water Rhett offered without a word. He drank deep, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and spurred his horse on, disappearing back into the shimmering heat. Rhett wiped his hands on his trousers before taking the letter. The paper was clean, the handwriting a delicate, looping script that seemed entirely out of place in this harsh landscape. It smelled faintly of lavender, a scent so foreign it was almost jarring. It was from her, Evelyn. He walked back to the porch, sat on the top step, and carefully broke the wax seal. For months, their letters had been his only link to a world he'd left behind, a world of parlors and pleasantries. He had been honest in his own letters, describing his life without flourish or apology. He was a rancher, a veteran, a man of simple means. He had nothing to offer but a solid roof, the promise of protection, and his name. In return, she had offered a future. Her letters spoke of her desire for a new beginning, of her skill in housekeeping, and of a shared hope for a quiet life. She was a photograph on his mantelpiece, A woman with serious eyes and a hint of a smile he couldn't quite decipher. An illusion woven from ink and paper. This letter, he knew, would be the last. My dearest Rhett, the long journey is nearing its end. By the time this letter reaches you, I will be on the final stagecoach to redemption. The world out here is larger and more rugged than I ever imagined. But the thought of our new life gives me strength. I pray I am all you hope for. I shall arrive within the week. Yours with all sincerity, Evelyn. Rhett read the letter twice, his thumb tracing the curve of her name. Within the week. The words settled in his gut, a solid weight of both promise and apprehension. The house, his fortress, would no longer be his alone. The silence he had so carefully cultivated was about to be broken. He folded the letter, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and stood up. There was work to be done. He needed to clear out the spare room, air out the linens his mother had packed away years ago. He needed to make a home out of his fortification. The storm rolled in 3 nights later, without warning, as they often did in the high plains. One moment, the sky was a blanket of stars. The next, the wind rose to a howl, and the heavens opened. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid wind-driven sheets, hammering against the roof and turning the dusty yard into a roiling sea of mud. Rhett sat by the fire, oiling a saddle harness, the rhythmic motion of his hands a counterpoint to the chaos outside. Pilgrim and the 2 cows were safe in the barn. The house was secure. He was an island in the tempest. That's when he heard it. A sound so faint it was almost lost in the roar of the wind. A frantic, desperate pounding on his door. He froze, every instinct honed by war screaming to life. No sane person would be out in this. He set the harness aside, his hand moving to the Colt Peacemaker holstered on the chair beside him. He rose, his steps silent on the wooden floorboards, and moved to the door. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice a low growl that carried easily over the storm. A woman's voice answered, thin and broken by sobs. "Please, please, I need help." He drew the heavy bar from the door and pulled it open a crack. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it wide against the interior wall. A figure stumbled in, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of soaked calico and misery. Rhett slammed the door shut against the storm and barred it again before turning. A young woman lay on the floor, shivering violently. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and her dress was ruined, caked in mud and torn at the hem. Beside her was a small, battered carpet bag, its contents likely as soaked as she was. He knelt, turning her over gently. She couldn't have been much older than 20. Her face was pale and drawn, but it was her eyes that stopped him. They were wide and dark, and utterly vacant. It was an emptiness that drank the light from the room, a hopelessness so profound it felt like a physical presence. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, pulling a thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, a useless gesture against the cold that had settled deep in her bones. "No, I have nowhere else to go." He helped her to her feet and guided her to the chair by the fire. He threw another log on the flames, which hissed and popped as stray drops of water from her clothes hit the embers. He poured a measure of whiskey into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Drink this, it'll warm you." Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the cup. He steadied it for her as she took a sip, coughing as the raw spirit hit her throat. But a faint touch of color returned to her cheeks. She looked around the simple, masculine room, the gun rack on the wall, the worn leather chair, the stark cleanliness of it all, as if trying to understand where she was. "Why here?" Rhett asked, his voice low and direct. He stood by the mantelpiece, his arms crossed, a formidable silhouette against the firelight. "Who are you?" "My name is Clara," she whispered, her voice raspy. "Clara May Thompson." She looked up at him, her gaze finally focusing. "My husband, his name was Jacob. Jacob Thompson. He worked for your father, years ago, before." Her voice trailed off, and a fresh wave of tears welled in her eyes. Rhett's expression didn't change, but a flicker of recognition passed through his mind. He remembered a lanky, quiet boy named Jacob who had been a decent hand with horses. He'd left his father's employ a few years before the war. "I remember him," Rhett said. "What about him?" "He's dead," she said, the words flat and heavy. They hanged him in redemption 3 weeks ago." The air in the room grew thick. A hanging was a grim business, but not an uncommon one. Horse thieves, cattle rustlers. The law was swift and brutal. "What was the charge?" Rhett asked. "Rustling," she choked out. "They said he stole cattle from the Miller place, but he didn't. Mr. Corrigan, he swore he didn't. He was a good man. He was just in the wrong place. Someone lied." She looked down at her trembling hands. "He was your father's man. I thought you might be a fair man. Like him, I had nowhere else to turn. The town, they look at me like I'm poison." Rhett processed the information in silence. The widow of a hanged rustler. It was a stain that wouldn't wash out. He understood the town's reaction. Fear and suspicion were the currency of the frontier. An accusation was as good as a conviction in the court of public opinion. He considered his situation. Evelyn was coming. A bride he had promised to provide for and protect. The last thing he needed was another woman in his house, especially one trailing a scandal like a shroud. It was a complication he couldn't afford. His first instinct, the one that had kept him alive through the war and the hard years after, was to say no, to give her food, a dry blanket, and send her on her way when the storm broke. But then he looked at her. He saw not the widow of a thief, but a girl drowning in a world that had already condemned her. He saw the raw, desperate plea in her eyes, the one that had carried her through a hellish storm to his door as a last resort. His father had always said, "A man's character ain't measured by how he treats his friends, but by how he treats the fallen." Jacob Thompson had worked for his family. That created a connection, a thread of obligation, however thin. He let out a slow breath, the decision settling uncomfortably within him. "The barn is dry," he said, his voice flat. "There's clean hay in the loft. You can stay there for a few days, until the weather clears and you can figure out what's next." Relief washed over Clara's face so intensely it was painful to watch. It was the look of someone who had been pulled from the edge of a cliff. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. "God bless you. Thank you." He simply nodded, unwilling to accept her gratitude. This was not charity. It was a temporary reprieve, a fulfillment of a duty he felt, however begrudgingly. He gave her a thick wool blanket from his own bed and led her out to the barn, the rain having lessened to a steady drizzle. He lit a lantern, showed her the ladder to the loft, and left her there with a final, curt instruction: "Don't start a fire." He returned to the house, the warmth of the fire no longer feeling as comfortable as it had before. The silence of the room was different now, filled with the presence of the woman in his barn. He sat down and picked up the harness, but his hands were still. His carefully ordered world had just been breached. The next day, the sun rose with a vengeance, quickly baking the mud into a hard, cracked shell. When Rhett went to the barn, he found Clara already awake. Trying to tidy her meager belonging, she looked small and lost in the cavernous space. He gave her a piece of jerky and a biscuit, which she ate with a quiet, desperate hunger. "I need to go into town for supplies," he announced, not looking at her. "You can ride on the wagon. You'll need to find work." The trip to Redemption was made in a tense silence. Clara sat on the buckboard, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if afraid to look at the town that had cast her out. Redemption was a typical frontier town, a single dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a mercantile, a smithy, and a church whose steeple seemed to poke accusingly at the sky. As Rhett tied the horses to the hitching post outside the mercantile, he felt the eyes on them. Whispers started like the rustle of dry leaves. He saw Mrs. Gable, the mercantile owner's wife, peer through the window, her face a mask of pinched disapproval before she disappeared into the shadows of the store. Two cattlemen standing on the boardwalk stopped their conversation, spat tobacco juice into the dust, and watched Clara with open, leering curiosity. "I'll be back in an hour," Rhett said to her, his voice low. "See what you can find." He watched her walk away, her back straight, her head held high in a pathetic show of defiance. He saw her approach the small dressmaker's shop. He went about his own business, buying flour, salt, and coffee, the entire time aware of the simmering gossip around him. "That's her, the rustler's wife," he heard a woman mutter. "What's she doing with Rhett Corrigan?" Figured he was above that sort of trouble. "A lonely man's an easy target for a woman like that," another voice, a man's, added with a sneer. "Bet she's looking for a new provider." Rhett's jaw tightened. He paid for his goods, his movements sharp and deliberate, his cold gaze daring anyone to speak their thoughts to his face. No one did. He stepped outside just in time to see Clara exiting the dressmaker's shop, her face paler than before. He then saw her cross the street to the town's only diner. He waited, leaning against a post in the shade, watching. A few minutes later, she came out again, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She walked slowly back toward the wagon, her hopeful defiance completely gone, replaced by the same hollow look he'd seen in her eyes the night before. She didn't have to tell him what happened. He knew. The town had closed its ranks. She was an outcast, and anyone associated with her risked the same fate. The ride back to the ranch was even quieter than the ride in. The weight of her failure filled the space between them. When they arrived, she didn't say a word, simply slid off the wagon and headed for the barn, her small form radiating a profound and terrible loneliness. Rhett unloaded the supplies, his movements methodical, but his mind was in turmoil. He had seen the town's cruelty firsthand. They weren't just punishing a dead man. They were condemning a living woman to slow starvation. It offended his sense of justice. It was a cowardice he couldn't abide. He had offered her shelter from a storm, but he was beginning to realize the storm wasn't over. It was the world itself. That evening, he found her in the loft, staring out the hay door at the setting sun, which was bleeding purple and orange across the sky. Her carpetbag was packed. "There's no place for me here," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I'll leave in the morning. Thank you for your kindness." Rhett looked at her, then at the vast, empty expanse of prairie stretching out to the horizon. "Leave to where?" he asked. "You've got no money. No one will hire you. You'll be dead or worse in a week." Tears finally welled in her eyes, hot and angry. "Then what am I supposed to do? I can't stay in your barn forever. I won't be a burden." He was silent for a long moment, the internal battle raging. Evelyn's face flashed in his mind. The woman from the photograph. The promise of a respectable life. Then he saw Clara's face, etched with a suffering so real it was a physical ache in the air around them. His code, the one forged in battle and tempered by solitude, made the choice for him. It was not a choice of the heart, but one of principle. He turned without another word and walked back to the house. She thought he was leaving her, and a small, choked sob escaped her lips. But a few minutes later, he reappeared at the bottom of the ladder. "Bring your things," he said, his voice rough. She looked at him, confused. "There's a room," he clarified, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere past her shoulder. "Behind the kitchen. It was for a hired hand. Long ago. It's small, but it's dry, and it's inside." He didn't wait for an answer, just turned and walked away. A moment later, he heard her slow, hesitant steps as she climbed down the ladder and followed him to the house. He showed her the room. It was little more than a closet with a cot, a small window, and a washstand. But to Clara, after the humiliation of the town and the cold loneliness of the barn, it was a palace. She stood in the doorway, her bag clutched in her hands, and looked at him. The word "thank you" seemed too small for the magnitude of what he had just done. He had brought her in. He had defied the town. He had offered her not just shelter, but a sliver of dignity. Rhett simply gave a short, stiff nod. "You earn your keep," he said, laying down the terms. "You'll cook, clean, mend. There's work enough for two." He left her then, closing the door to his own room and to the new, unwelcome complexity of his life. He pulled Evelyn's letter from his pocket and read it again in the dim lamplight. "I pray I am all you hope for." He stared at the words, a deep, unsettling feeling coiling in his stomach. He was a man who kept his promises. He would have a bride, but as he listened to the faint sounds of a weeping woman settling into the small room behind his kitchen, he knew that the simple, quiet life he had promised her had already vanished. The stagecoach arrived on a Tuesday. Exactly 6 days after Rhett had received the letter, it appeared on the horizon as a smudge of dust, slowly resolving into a lumbering shape that seemed to crawl across the immense landscape. Rhett was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a familiar heartbeat against the silence. He saw the coach and paused, axe buried in a half-split round of cottonwood. He stood for a long moment, watching it draw nearer, his shoulders squaring as if bracing for an impact. This was it, the future, arriving in a cloud of alkali dust. Inside the house, Clara was kneading dough for the evening's bread. She, too, saw the coach through the small kitchen window. The sight sent a jolt of ice through her veins. Her hands stilled in the floury mass. She felt an instinctive urge to hide, to retreat into the shadows of her small room. This was the rightful lady of the house arriving. Her own presence here was a mistake, an anomaly that was about to be corrected. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron and faded back from the window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Rhett walked to the front of the house, his stride measured and deliberate. He had put on a clean shirt, a rare concession to formality. The coach groaned to a halt, the horses blowing and stamping in the heat. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of dust and wrinkles, tipped his hat. "Got a passenger for you, Corrigan." The door opened, and she emerged. Evelyn. She was not like the women of redemption. She stepped down from the coach with a practiced grace, her movements fluid and contained despite the dust and the long journey. Her traveling dress was of a dark, sensible serge, impeccably tailored, with a high collar that framed a face of pale, composed beauty. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned in a severe but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. She was thinner than her photograph had suggested, with a fragility about her that seemed at odds with the harsh sunlight. She carried a single, modest trunk and a small reticule, but it was her eyes that held Rhett's attention. They were a cool, intelligent gray, and they scanned the raw landscape, the simple log house, and finally, him, with an expression that was impossible to read. It was not warmth, nor was it disappointment. It was assessment. "Mr. Corrigan," she said, her voice lower and softer than he'd imagined. "I am Evelyn Hayes." "Ma'am," Rhett replied, nodding. He took her trunk, the weight of it surprisingly light. "Welcome. It was a long ride." "It was," she agreed, her gaze sweeping past him, toward the open door of the house. And that is when she saw Clara, who had been unable to stop herself from peering out from the shadows of the main room. For a heartbeat, the two women's eyes met across the sun-drenched yard. Evelyn's cool assessment sharpened into something else entirely, a quick, penetrating scrutiny that was as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. It was a look that catalogued every detail: Clara's plain, mended dress, the flower on her hands, her youth, and the way she stood half-hidden in the doorway of what was meant to be Evelyn's home. Evelyn's carefully composed expression did not change, but a subtle tension tightened the corners of her mouth. Rhett, oblivious to the silent, charged exchange, gestured toward the house. "Let's get you inside, out of the sun." The awkwardness began immediately. The house, which had seemed a sufficient fortress for one, and manageable for two, suddenly felt impossibly small with three. Every space was crowded, every silence filled with unspoken questions. Rhett introduced them with his typical bluntness. "Evelyn, this is Clara Thompson. Her husband passed. She's working for her keep." He said it as if explaining the presence of a stray dog he'd taken in. He hoped the practical nature of the arrangement would be clear. Evelyn inclined her head, a gesture of polite acknowledgement that held no warmth. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, her tone perfectly level. "Miss Hayes," Clara mumbled, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. She felt the heat of a deep, burning shame creep up her neck. She was an obstacle, a piece of unwanted furniture in the way of this woman's new life. The tour of the house was brief. Rhett showed Evelyn the main room, the large fieldstone hearth, and the room that was to be hers, the one he had aired out, with its sturdy bedstead and the quilt his mother had made. It was next to his own. Clara's room, the small chamber behind the kitchen, was not mentioned. That first dinner was a trial of excruciating tension. Clara, in her role as housekeeper, served the meal, a simple stew she had simmered all afternoon. She moved around the table with a quiet efficiency that was meant to make her invisible, but instead, it only highlighted her presence. Evelyn sat straight-backed in her chair, a stark figure of Eastern propriety in the rustic cabin. She had traveled thousands of miles into the wilderness, staked everything on the promises of a man she'd never met, only to arrive and find another woman already living under his roof, a young, widowed woman. Her mind, sharpened by a lifetime of precariousness, saw not a pitiable stray, but a rival. She saw Clara's quiet competence not as help, but as a campaign to entrench herself. "The stew is very hearty, Mrs. Thompson," Evelyn commented, her voice carrying a faint, musical lilt that made Clara's own rougher accent feel clumsy. "In Boston, we would perhaps add a touch of wine for flavor." "We don't have wine here," Rhett said simply, eating his stew without noticing the subtle barb. Clara said nothing, just kept her head down and ate quickly. As soon as she was finished, she stood to clear the plates, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the room. "Please, leave them," Evelyn said, her voice stopping Clara in her tracks. "That is my duty now." It was a declaration of territory. Clara froze, plate in hand, caught between her desire to be useful and Evelyn's clear dismissal. Rhett looked up, finally sensing the friction. "Clara works for her keep, Evelyn," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Let her do the work." Evelyn's lips thinned, but she did not press the matter. She simply inclined her head in a gesture of concession. But a line had been drawn in the sand. The battle for the domestic heart of the house had begun, and it would be fought not with loud words, but in the silent spaces, in the folding of laundry, the brewing of coffee, the mending of a shirt. In the days that followed, Clara felt the walls of the small house closing in on her. She tried to make herself scarce, rising before dawn to get her chores done and retreating to her small room whenever Evelyn and Rhett were in the main room. She felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of a new family's formation. Several times, she packed her meager belongings, her resolve firm. She would leave. She would take her chances on the road rather than endure another day of Evelyn's cold, watchful eyes or the shame of being a constant, unwelcome presence. The second time, Rhett found her with her bag packed, standing by the barn as if gathering the courage to step out into the vast, indifferent wilderness. His patience wore thin. "And where do you think you're going this time?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. "I can't stay here," she whispered, not looking at him. This is her home now. I am in the way." Rhett scrubbed a hand over his face, a gesture of deep frustration. He looked at her, so small and determined. And then, out at the endless prairie, He knew what awaited a lone woman out there. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. He took a step closer, forcing her to meet his gaze. "I told you that you could stay. I don't break my word. What happens in that house? The quietness. That's between you and her. I won't have it, but I also won't have your death on my conscience." He paused, his gray eyes pinning her. "This is a home, not a jail. You are free to walk out that gate. But if you leave, where is safer?" His words, brutal in their honesty, struck her harder than any kindness would have. He wasn't asking her to stay for his sake, or even for Evelyn's. He was stating a fact. There was nowhere safer. Defeated. She allowed him to take her bag from her hand and followed him back to the house, back to her cage, from the window. Evelyn watched them, her expression unreadable, and misinterpreted his act of gruff duty as one of tender concern. Her suspicion hardened into a cold certainty. This woman was trying to steal her husband. The silent war between the two women escalated. Evelyn, in an attempt to claim her role, would rearrange the items on the mantelpiece, a subtle but clear act of possession. Clara would find them and, in the course of her daily dusting, silently move them back. Evelyn began to insist on cooking the evening meal, her dishes more elaborate than Clara's simple fare, though often ill-suited to the limited pantry of the ranch. Rhett would eat what was put before him without comment, but his quiet appreciation for Clara's familiar, hearty breakfasts did not go unnoticed by either woman. Once, Rhett tore his sleeve on a nail while repairing the corral. He came in, swearing under his breath, before Evelyn could fetch her sewing basket, with its neat spools of thread and silver thimble. Clara had taken the shirt from him. With deft, practiced movements, she patched the tear with a piece of scrap denim, her stitches small and strong, a repair meant to withstand hard work. She handed it back to him in minutes. Evelyn watched the exchange, her own fine needlepoint skills feeling suddenly useless and ornamental. Clara knew the realities of this life. Evelyn only knew the theory. For Rhett, the house had become a minefield. The comfortable silence he had once cherished was now a heavy, charged thing, thick with resentment and anxiety. He found himself spending more and more time outdoors, seeking refuge in the familiar solitude of the open range. He would ride out to the farthest fences and stay there until dusk, repairing sections that didn't need it, just to delay his return. He felt caught between two opposing forces. Evelyn was the dream he had ordered through the mail. She was beautiful, she was educated, and she represented a life of refinement he thought he should want. She was his intended wife, a promise he had made to himself and to her. But their conversations were stilted, full of awkward pauses. They were two strangers trying to build a life on a foundation of letters and expectations. Clara, on the other hand, was the undeniable reality. She was a constant, silent presence who understood the rhythms of his life without needing to be told. She knew how he took his coffee, knew which tools he would need before he asked for them, and moved about her work with a quiet competence that he had come to rely on. She was a problem, a complication, a reminder of the harshness of the world, but she was real. He found himself thinking, with a discomfort that bordered on guilt, that the house ran more smoothly, felt more like a functioning home. In the week before Evelyn had arrived, he was a man trapped between an illusion he'd constructed and a reality he was trying to ignore. The breaking point came nearly a month after Evelyn's arrival. The late summer heat had been relentless, and the work on the ranch was unending. In her desperate bid to earn her keep, to be worth the space she occupied, Clara had been pushing herself to the brink. She was the first to rise and the last to sleep, taking on every grueling task she could find, from hauling endless buckets of water for the garden to scrubbing the floors on her hands and knees until the wood was pale. One evening, as she was serving dinner, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The room tilted, and the tin plate in her hand clattered to the floor. She swayed, her face ashen. and before Rhett could get to his feet, she crumpled into a heap. Rhett was at her side in an instant. He touched her forehead and swore. "She's burning up." He lifted her effortlessly. She weighed next to nothing and carried her to her small room, laying her gently on the cot. Her breathing was shallow, and a feverish sheen coated her skin. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her hands clasped together, her face a complicated mask of shock and alarm. "It's a fever," Rhett said, his voice tight with concern. "From the heat and from working too hard." He looked at Evelyn, his expression direct. "I need to see to the animals before dark. Can you get some cool water and cloths? We need to get the fever down." Evelyn nodded, her own anxieties momentarily pushed aside by the urgency of the situation. She fetched a basin of water from the well and tore strips from a clean linen sheet. All evening, she and Rhett took turns bathing Clara's face and wrists, trying to cool her burning skin. Clara tossed and turned, caught in the grip of a delirium, muttering names, Jacob, Mama, and fragments of prayer. By midnight, she was no better. Rhett was exhausted, his face etched with worry. He had to be up in 4 hours to begin his own grueling day. He looked at Evelyn, the flickering lantern light casting deep shadows under her eyes. "I have to get some sleep," he said, his voice low. Can you sit with her?" Evelyn looked at the woman on the cot, her rival, now utterly helpless and dependent. A part of her, a dark and selfish part, wanted to refuse, but she couldn't. She saw not the usurper, but a desperately sick girl. She nodded. "I will stay." Rhett gave her a grateful look that twisted something in her chest, and then retreated to his room. Evelyn was left alone in the small, stifling room with the sound of Clara's labored breathing and the scent of sickness. The hours that followed were a strange vigil. Evelyn sat on a small wooden stool, dipping the cloth in the cool water and laying it gently on Clara's forehead, her neck, her wrists, in the grip of the fever. Clara's defenses were gone. The stoic, quiet housekeeper had vanished, replaced by a vulnerable, broken child. She whimpered in her sleep, her hands occasionally clenching as if fighting off some unseen phantom. Once, her eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. She looked right at Evelyn, but she saw someone else. "I'm sorry, Jacob," she whispered, a tear tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "I'm so sorry. I couldn't stop them." The raw, undiluted grief in that whisper struck Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a cunning rival, a woman scheming to steal a man. This was a girl who had watched her husband die, who had been cast out and reviled, who worked herself to the point of collapse out of a desperate fear of being a burden. As Evelyn ministered to her, she began to notice things she had refused to see before: the raw, chapped skin of Clara's hands, the gauntness of her face now that the fever had stripped away her careful composure, the way her small frame seemed to be held together by pure, stubborn will. She was not an adversary. She was a survivor. All of Evelyn's own fears and insecurities, her jealousy and suspicion, began to feel petty and cruel in the face of such profound suffering. She, too, had come west to escape a past full of pain. She, too, knew what it was to be alone and afraid. For the first time, she saw not a rival for a place in Rhett's house, but a reflection of her own desperation. She sat through the long, dark hours. The only sounds the chirping of crickets outside and Clara's unsteady breathing. She did not doze. She watched, and she listened, and she tended. And somewhere in the deep, quiet heart of the night, as she gently bathed the face of the woman she had considered her enemy, the ice around her own heart began to thaw. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the small window, Clara's breathing had eased. Her skin was cooler to the touch. The fever had broken. She was asleep now, a deep, healing sleep. Evelyn sat back, exhausted but strangely calm. She looked at Clara's peaceful face and felt not triumph, not suspicion, but a new and unsettling stirring of compassion. The foundation of her world had shifted. The lines she had drawn so clearly between friend and foe, between what was hers and what was not, had begun to blur. She was no longer certain of anything, except that the story of the woman sleeping on the cot was one she needed to understand. Clara recovered slowly, the fever having scoured her of what little reserve strength she possessed. In the quiet days that followed, a fragile truce settled over the small house. Evelyn, moved by a compassion that had taken her by surprise, tended to Clara with a gentle, solicitous care. She would bring her broth, read to her from a worn copy of a book she'd brought from the East, and ensure she didn't try to work before her body was ready. Clara accepted the kindness with a confused, wary gratitude. The cold, watchful eyes of her rival had been replaced by a gaze of thoughtful concern, a change so profound it was disorienting. The silence between them was no longer a weapon, but a space of contemplation. They began to work together, their movements falling into a new, collaborative rhythm. One afternoon, they sat on the porch, sheltered from the relentless sun, shelling a small basket of beans from the wilting garden. For a long while, the only sound was the soft plink of the beans falling into a tin bowl. It was Evelyn who finally broke the quiet, her voice low and even. "Rhett never speaks of the war," she said, her hands not pausing in their work. "But he carries it with him. I see it in his eyes." She glanced at Clara. "Your husband. Did you know Rhett before?" Clara's hands stilled. She looked out at the parched, brown land, her eyes seeing a different time. "Jacob knew him," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "It was before the war, when Rhett was just a young man, hot-headed and proud. There was trouble. Some men tried to jump his father's claim on a watering hole. It was an ambush. Jacob, he was just a ranch hand. But he was loyal. He saw what was happening and he rode into it." She paused, the memory vivid and painful. "There was shouting, and a gun went off. Jacob pulled Rhett from under a spooked horse and fought off one of the men. When the dust settled, Rhett was safe, but he saw Jacob standing over the man he'd fought, and he thought the worst. He thought Jacob was part of it, that he had turned on him. Jacob tried to explain, but Rhett wouldn't listen. The pride was wounded. You see, he couldn't stand the idea that a simple hired hand had saved his life." Evelyn stopped shelling beans, her full attention now on Clara. Rhett's father knew the truth and straightened it out, but the trust between them was broken. Jacob left the ranch not long after. Rhett never forgot it. He never forgave Jacob for seeing him when he was weak. Clara's voice grew heavy with a sorrow that was years old but still raw. So later, when Mr. Miller accused Jacob of rustling his cattle, it was easy for people to believe. Jacob was quiet. He had few friends, and Rhett Corrigan, he didn't speak up for him. I heard later that Rhett told the sheriff he thought the whole charge smelled wrong, that it was too convenient, but he never said it loud enough. He never stood for Jacob, because in his mind, Jacob was still the man from that ambush. Clara took a shaky breath, her gaze becoming distant and unfocused. "So, they built the gallows, right in the center of town." Her voice dropped so low Evelyn had to lean in to hear it. "I stood across the street, behind the livery stable. I couldn't get any closer. They wouldn't let me. I just watched. I watched the sky and prayed for rain, for a fire, for the earth to open up and swallow the whole town, but the sun just kept shining." She looked at Evelyn, her eyes hollow. "I saw it all, and I couldn't do anything but stand there." The image hung in the hot, still air between them. A young woman, alone, forced to witness the brutal, unjust end of her entire world. Evelyn felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Her own carefully constructed walls of propriety and composure felt flimsy and absurd in the face of such a raw, visceral horror. She reached out, her hand tentatively covering Clara's. Clara flinched at the unexpected contact, but she didn't pull away. Later that day, The oppressive heat drove them to the relative cool of the barn. Rhett was out on the range, checking the last of the dying water holes. A heavy, emotional silence lingered between the women. Clara was currying Pilgrim, her movements slow and methodical, a way of losing herself in a simple task. Evelyn stood by the doorway, watching the bars of light that slanted through the gaps in the wood, illuminating swirling dust motes. Clara's confession had unlocked something in her, a need to share the weight of her own secrets, to be seen for who she truly was, not the composed mail-order bride she pretended to be. "The letters I wrote to Rhett, they were not the entire truth," Evelyn began, her voice so soft it was almost carried away by the barn's dusty silence. Clara stopped brushing the horse, her back still to Evelyn, listening. "I wrote of a new beginning," Evelyn continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But I did not write what I was running from. I let Mr. Corrigan believe he was getting a proper wife, a woman of good standing, untouched by the world." She wrapped her arms around herself, a protective gesture. "That is not who I am." She took a breath, the words coming in a painful rush. "Back home, there was a man, a kinsman, my cousin's husband, a man who should have been my protector. He had a darkness in him. One night, he took from me what was not his to take. He violated my trust and my person in the worst of ways." She spoke the words gently, but they were laden with a lifetime of shame. "After, he acted as if nothing had happened. And I was expected to do the same, to bear the shame of his sin in silence." Clara slowly turned, her face a canvas of dawning comprehension and empathy. "But the shame, it grew," Evelyn whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It grew inside me. I was with child, his child. I couldn't tell anyone. The ruin, the disgrace, it would have destroyed my family. Writing to Rhett, coming west. It wasn't a choice. It was an escape. It was the only door open to me." Her composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "The journey was so hard, the rocking of the train, the terrible food, the crowded stagecoach. I was so sick, somewhere in the plains of Nebraska. I lost the baby, all alone, in a dirty room in a boarding house. I buried him in a small wooden box under a lone tree. No one ever knew. I arrived in redemption with nothing but an empty trunk and an even emptier womb." The final confession hung in the air, a truth so terrible and so lonely it seemed to suck the very breath from the barn. All of Evelyn's poise, her cool elegance, her guarded suspicion, it was all a fragile armor, hiding a wound so deep it was still bleeding. Clara walked toward her, her own grief momentarily forgotten in the face of Evelyn's. She didn't say a word. There were no words for such a pain. Instead, she simply opened her arms. Evelyn collapsed into the embrace, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs, finally allowing herself to grieve for the child she'd never known and the innocence she had lost. Clara held her, her own tears falling freely now, mingling with Evelyn's. They clung to each other in the dusty, golden light of the barn. Two survivors of different shipwrecks, washed ashore on the same desolate island. They cried for lost husbands and lost children, for the brutality of men and the indifference of the world, and in that shared sorrow, the last vestiges of rivalry and suspicion dissolved into a profound, unspoken understanding. Rhett returned late, the weariness of a long, fruitless search etched on his face. The water holes were drying up. A real drought was setting in. He went to the barn to put Pilgrim away and grab a harness that needed mending. As he approached the wide, open doors, he heard the low murmur of voices from within. He stopped, not wanting to intrude. He was about to turn back to the house when he caught the last broken words of Evelyn's confession, followed by the sound of weeping. He stood frozen in the shadows, hidden from view, the harness forgotten in his hand. He had heard enough. "I lost the baby. I buried him." The words hit him like a physical blow. The elegant, mysterious woman from the letters, the woman he had constructed in his mind, was a fiction. The real Evelyn was a woman of unimaginable strength, who had endured a terrible violation, a secret pregnancy, and the loss of a child, all while crossing a continent to stake her future on a stranger. And Clara, he had known her story was tragic, but hearing the raw pain of her account of Jacob's hanging, and the old, bitter link to his own prideful mistake, filled him with a cold, hollow guilt. He had sought a wife as a remedy for his own loneliness. He'd thought of it as a practical arrangement, a way to build a future, to bring a semblance of salvation to his empty house. He backed away from the barn, his steps silent in the thick dust, his mind reeling. He had been so wrong. He hadn't been seeking a partner. He had been seeking a solution. He now saw that these two women were not solutions to his problems. They were complex, profoundly wounded souls, each fighting their own desperate war. He was not their rescuer. He was just another broken person, standing in the wreckage alongside them. The drought tightened its grip over the following weeks. The sky remained a metallic, cloudless blue. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the land until the earth cracked open in a network of fissures, like a pleading mouth. The creek bed turned to a ribbon of baked mud, and the grass in the pastures bleached to the color of old bone before turning to dust. Survival became the only thing that mattered. The fragile peace forged in the barn became a solid, working alliance. The three of them became a single unit, their individual griefs and histories subsumed by the urgent, all-consuming task of keeping the ranch alive. They rose before dawn each day, the air still holding a hint of the night's coolness, and worked until long after the sun had set. They traveled for miles to the river, which had shrunk to a sluggish, muddy stream, and spent back-breaking days cutting the tall, coarse grass that grew along its banks, bundling it for winter fodder. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized by shared purpose. Rhett's powerful swings with the scythe, Evelyn's surprisingly strong and steady hands as she raked and bundled, Clara's tireless energy as she loaded the wagon. They spoke little, conserving their energy, communicating through nods and gestures. A team forged in the crucible of hardship. The old roles of intended bride and housekeeper were burned away by the relentless sun. They were simply three people fighting for their lives. One afternoon, they were miles from home, gathering fallen wood from a dried-up copse of cottonwoods, when the air grew unnaturally still. The relentless drone of the cicadas ceased. A strange, yellowish gloom fell over the landscape, and the sun became a pale, hazy disk in the sky. Rhett stopped, dropping a heavy branch, and scanned the western horizon. "Get in the wagon," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." A dark, ominous line was rising from the earth, a churning wall of brown that stretched from one end of the horizon to the other. A sandstorm, and it was moving fast. They scrambled onto the wagon, and Rhett whipped the horses into a desperate gallop. But it was too late. The wall of dust was a living thing, a monstrous entity that devoured the sky. The wind hit them first, a furious hot blast that tore at their clothes and stung their eyes with sand. Within moments, the world disappeared. Day turned to a suffocating, brown twilight. The air was thick with flying grit that made it painful to breathe. "There's an old line shack," Rhett yelled over the roar of the wind. "To the north! We have to find it!" He guided the terrified horses by instinct, unable to see more than a few feet ahead. The shack, a dilapidated relic from a long-abandoned cattle run, appeared out of the maelstrom like a ghost. It was little more than a collapsing shed, half its roof missing, but it was shelter. Rhett fought the horses to a stop, and the three of them stumbled from the wagon, covering their faces with their arms, and half-crawled through the doorway, collapsing inside as the full fury of the storm broke over them. Inside, it was nearly pitch black. The wind shrieked through the gaps in the walls, and sand poured in through the broken roof, piling up in drifts on the dirt floor. The noise was deafening, a constant, terrifying roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. They huddled together in the center of the small space, away from the collapsing walls, their bodies pressed close for warmth and reassurance against the terrifying chaos outside. In that roaring darkness, stripped of all pretense, all history, all roles, they were just three frightened souls. Words were impossible, useless. There was only the storm, and the fragile, shared space of their shelter. In the midst of the maelstrom, Rhett felt a primal, protective instinct rise in him. He reached out into the darkness, his hand finding Evelyn's. Her fingers were cold, and she grasped his hand with a desperate strength. He didn't let go. Then, with his other hand, he fumbled through the darkness until he found Clara's. Her hand was calloused and smaller, but it gripped his with the same fierce need. He held them both, one in each hand, the three of them, linked together in the heart of the storm. He wasn't choosing, he was connecting, he was holding onto his entire world. In the roaring, sandy darkness, there was no past, no future, only this single, profound moment. Evelyn, the dream that had become a woman of incredible strength. Clara, the reality that had become a woman of quiet resilience. He held their hands, and he felt not the weight of two separate burdens, but the solid, grounding anchor of a shared existence. No one spoke. They didn't need to. In the silent, desperate grip of their hands, something new and unnamed was being forged. The storm passed as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving the world scoured and still. In the pale, washed-out light of dawn, they emerged from the dilapidated shack into a landscape transformed. The air was clean, stripped of its dust, and a profound silence had fallen over the plains. The fury of the storm had broken the drought's fever, and in its wake, a strange and fragile peace remained. The journey back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. It was not the heavy silence of tension, but the soft, contemplative silence of shared experience. The memory of their hands, clasped together in the roaring darkness, was a palpable presence in the space between them. That evening, after the horses were tended to, and a simple meal had been eaten, Evelyn found Rhett on the porch. He was staring out at the horizon, his shoulders set in a line of deep, troubled thought. He was wrestling with the impossible equation of his life. He had made a promise to this woman, a vow to be her husband, her protector. But the woman in the room behind him, the one who moved with a quiet, wounded grace, had laid claim to a part of his conscience. And now, to something deeper he didn't dare name. He felt the crushing weight of an impending choice, a choice he knew would shatter the fragile peace they had found. Evelyn stood beside him, not touching, just sharing the same view of the vast, twilight plains. "You are a man who keeps his word. Rhett Corrigan," she said, her voice soft but clear in the still air. "I know that. It is why I came here." He turned to look at her, his face grim. "Evelyn, She held up a hand, stopping him. "Let me speak, please." She took a breath, her gaze steady and unafraid. "The night of the storm, I realized something. I came here seeking a sanctuary, a safe harbor from the life I left behind. I thought that harbor was a husband, a home, a name. I thought it was a role I had to fill, a position I had to defend." She looked away from him, toward the darkened window of the kitchen where a faint light glowed. "But I was wrong. A home isn't a structure of logs, and a sanctuary isn't a piece of paper from a preacher. It is a feeling of being seen, of being safe enough to be your truest self." She turned back to him, and in her cool gray eyes, he saw not a bride making a demand, but a woman stating a profound and revolutionary truth. "I do not need you to choose," she said, the words simple, but carrying the weight of a world-altering revelation. A choice implies one is right and the other is wrong. That one is kept and one is discarded. That is not what this is. I just want to be loved. Rhett, truly loved, in the same way. She paused, her voice softening with a sense of wonder. That I am learning to love her. Rhett was struck dumb. Of all the scenarios he had played out in his mind, tears, accusations, demands, this was not one of them. She was not asking him to solve a problem. She was asking him to accept a reality, one that was bigger and more complicated than any rulebook had ever prepared him for. He had no answer for her. He could only stand there, the foundations of his world irrevocably shaken. Inside, Clara felt the shift as well. The kindness Evelyn had shown her since the fever had blossomed into a genuine, tender affection. They would work together, their hands sometimes brushing, and instead of pulling away, a jolt of warmth would pass between them. They would sit in the evenings, mending clothes by the firelight, and find themselves sharing stories, small pieces of their pasts, weaving a tapestry of shared experience that was uniquely their own. Clara found herself looking at Evelyn not with fear, but with a deep, burgeoning admiration for her strength, her intelligence, and the quiet sorrow she carried so gracefully. But with this new, warm acceptance came a fresh and agonizing wave of guilt. She was no longer just the housekeeper. She was part of something for which there was no name, and she felt like a thief, stealing affection that was not rightfully hers. She was the widow of a hanged man, a woman with a stained name, living in the home of a man and his intended bride. Every shared smile with Evelyn felt like a betrayal of the natural order. Every moment of ease in Rhett's presence felt like a sin. One morning, she could bear it no longer. Before the sun had risen, she packed her small bag for the final time. This was not a flight of fear, but an act of what she saw as penance. She would remove herself from the equation. She would disappear and allow their lives to become what they were supposed to be. She slipped out of the house and was halfway to the main gate when a voice called her name. "Clara?" It was Evelyn, standing on the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the pre-dawn chill. She hadn't been asleep. She had been watching. "Don't," Evelyn said, her voice firm, yet gentle. "I have to," Clara whispered, her throat tight with unshed tears. "This is wrong. I am wrong. I don't belong here." Evelyn walked across the yard, her bare feet silent in the dust, until she stood directly in front of Clara. She reached out and took the carpet bag from Clara's hand, setting it on the ground. Then she took both of Clara's hands in her own. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Look at me," she commanded. Clara reluctantly lifted her gaze. "Do I seem wrong to you? Do I look like a woman whose happiness you are stealing?" In Evelyn's eyes, Clara saw no accusation, no pity. She saw only a deep, unwavering sincerity. "You belong where you are loved. Clara Thompson," Evelyn said, her voice fierce with conviction. "And you are loved here. By me. This is your home now. Our home. Don't you dare run away from it." Clara's resolve crumbled. She sagged against Evelyn, who held her, stroking her hair as the first rays of the sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. Rhett watched them from the window, a silent observer of a conversation and a bond that existed entirely outside of him. And he understood. This was no longer his decision to make. It was a current, and he was simply being carried along in it. The days that followed were a study in quiet transformation. The three of them moved around each other with a new, heightened awareness. It was in the small things, the way Evelyn would pour Clara a cup of coffee before she poured her own. The way Rhett would bring them both a wildflower he'd found by the creek bed, handing one to each without ceremony. The way Clara would save the best piece of bread for Evelyn, or mend a small tear in Rhett's jacket before he'd even noticed it. There were lingering looks across the dinner table, glances held a moment too long, filled with a hesitant, questioning warmth. There were accidental touches that weren't accidental at all. A hand brushing a shoulder, fingers grazing as they reached for the same tool. Each small gesture was a question, and the lack of retreat was the answer. They were mapping a new territory, navigating by instinct. Their only compass the strange, undeniable rightness of what they were feeling. The drought held, and the nights remained warm and clear. The sky a dizzying canopy of stars. They often took their supper outside, building a small campfire in the yard to keep the insects at bay. It was on one of these nights, the fire crackling, the moon a sliver of silver in the inky blackness, that the unspoken truth finally found its voice. They sat in a companionable silence, watching the flames dance. Rhett was on one side of the fire, the two women on the other, sitting close on a rough-hewn bench. The heat from the fire warmed their faces, while the vast, cool darkness of the prairie was at their backs. Evelyn leaned her head back, looking up at the Milky Way, a shimmering river of light across the heavens. "It's so beautiful," she murmured. "Out here, away from all the rules and the noise, you can almost believe that anything is possible." She turned her head, her gaze moving from Clara's fire-lit profile to Rhett's shadowed face across the flames. Her expression was serious, thoughtful, and utterly open. "If we all feel this is right," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath of wind, yet it carried to both of them with perfect clarity. "If, in our hearts, this does not feel like a sin, then why should we regret it?" The question hung in the air, audacious and liberating. It was the key. Turning the lock on the final door of their restraint, it gave them permission. Clara felt a tremor run through her. She looked at Evelyn, and then at Rhett. In his eyes, she saw not judgment, but the same deep, yearning confusion that was in her own heart. He was as lost and as found as they were. Slowly, as if in a trance, Evelyn reached out and laid her hand on the space of the bench between herself and Clara. A simple invitation. After a moment that stretched for an eternity, Clara tentatively placed her own hand beside Evelyn's, their fingers brushing. A spark of warmth, of connection, passed between them. Then, Rhett rose from his side of the fire. He didn't walk around it. He stepped deliberately through the low flames, sparks scattering at his feet, and sat down on the bench beside Clara, closing the circle. The air grew thick, charged with a decade of unspoken feelings. Hesitantly, Rhett reached out, his calloused, scarred hand covering Clara's. Her hand was so small beneath his. He felt her tremble, but she didn't pull away. Then, he felt another hand, softer, cooler, cover his own. Evelyn. Their three hands were stacked, a testament of silent, mutual consent. Rhett turned his head, his gaze falling on Clara. Her face was illuminated by the fire, her eyes wide and luminous with a mixture of fear and wonder. He lifted his other hand and gently, so gently, brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. His fingers lingered for a second on her skin, a touch that was both a question and a revelation. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. Then he turned to Evelyn. She was watching them, her expression one of profound, heartbreaking tenderness. He reached for her, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking the line of her cheek. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She simply met his gaze, her own hand rising to cover his. In the flickering firelight, under a billion distant stars, they were the only three people in the world. There was no law, no church, no town full of judging eyes. There was only this, a connection so powerful and so strange, it defied all definition. It was a love born of tragedy, forged in hardship, and finally, timidly, acknowledged in the vast, forgiving silence of the plains. They had not chosen this. It had chosen them, and in that moment, they chose to accept it. Their new reality was a fragile, beautiful thing, existing only within the boundaries of the ranch. But the ranch was not an island. They needed supplies. A week later, Rhett rode into Redemption. The change was immediate. As he walked into the mercantile, the usual hum of conversation died. Mrs. Gable, who usually offered a piece of hard candy, counted his money with pursed lips and turned her back on him the moment the transaction was complete. Men on the boardwalk who would normally offer a nod fell silent as he passed, their eyes following him with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. The whispers followed him like his own shadow. Living in sin, the lot of 'em. 2 women in one house. It's an abomination. That Thompson widow knew she was trouble the moment she showed up. The final, brutal confirmation came from Father Michael. The priest met Rhett on the steps of the church, his face a mask of sorrowful condemnation. "Rhett, my son," he began, his voice heavy. "The things I am hearing, they trouble my soul. Your intended, Miss Hayes, has been here for months, yet you have not come to me to arrange the wedding." "We've been busy," Rhett said, his voice hard. "The drought." "Is that all it is?" the priest asked, his eyes boring into Rhett. "Or is it that you cannot choose which woman will stand beside you at the altar? I cannot and will not give God's blessing to a household of such confusion. You must put the widow out. Rhett, you must cleanse your home of this scandal, for your own soul's sake." Rhett looked at the man of God, at his clean robes and his righteous certainty, and he felt not a shred of guilt. He felt only a cold, protective fury. "My soul," Rhett said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is my own concern, and my home is my own concern." He turned and walked away, leaving the priest standing on the church steps. As he rode out of town, he felt the collective gaze of redemption on his back. The whispers had found a voice. The world they had tried to keep at bay was now hammering at their door. The fragile peace they had built was about to be put to the test. The official summons came a week later, delivered by a grim-faced deputy sheriff who refused to meet Rhett's eyes. The town council of Redemption requested his presence. It was not a request. Rhett knew what it was: a trial. He saddled Pilgrim, his movements economical and precise, but a cold, hard anger had settled in his gut. When he told the women, he saw the same fear flicker in both their eyes. Clara's face went pale, her hand instinctively going to her throat. Evelyn, however, stepped forward, her expression resolute. She placed a hand on his arm. "Say what is in your heart, Rhett," she said, her voice low but steady. "Tell them the truth. It is all we have left." The council met in the back room of the mercantile, a cramped, airless space that smelled of stale tobacco and self-importance. The 5 men who ran the town sat behind a long table. Miller, the cattle baron whose accusation had sent Jacob Thompson to the gallows. Gable, the mercantile owner, a man whose morality was as pinched as his face. The blacksmith, the sheriff, and Father Michael. They were the arbiters of redemption, the guardians of its fragile, rigid order. They let Rhett stand before them like a prisoner in the dock. Sheriff Thompson, a man who enforced the law but rarely questioned it, cleared his throat. "Rhett, we've called you here on a matter of public decency," he began, his gaze fixed on the table. "There are concerns about the arrangement at your ranch." Miller leaned forward, his beefy hands clasped over his ample stomach. "It's unnatural. Corrigan, you took in the rustler's widow, which was soft-headed but your own business. But now you've got your intended bride under the same roof. It's been months. There's no wedding. People are talking. It makes the whole town look bad. It's an offense against God and society." "An abomination," Father Michael added, his voice resonating with sorrowful authority. "A household built on a foundation of sin. You are leading 2 women into temptation and endangering your own immortal soul." Rhett listened, his expression unreadable, his body perfectly still. He let them all speak, Let their accusations and their pious concerns fill the small room. They spoke of propriety, of the law, of God's will. They spoke of everything but the truth. When they had finished, a heavy silence fell. They all looked at him, expecting contrition, or perhaps defiance. They were waiting for his defense. "So you want me to choose?" Rhett said, his voice flat, cutting through the thick atmosphere. It was not a question. Gable nodded eagerly. "Of course, a man has one wife. It is the law. It is decent. Send the Thompson woman on her way. Marry Miss Hayes, as you promised. Put things right." Rhett's gaze swept over their faces, seeing not leaders, but small, fearful men, terrified of anything they could not understand or control. He thought of Evelyn's courage, of Clara's quiet resilience. He thought of their hands in his during the storm, of the fragile, beautiful life they were trying to build in a world determined to tear it down. The cold anger in his gut coalesced into a pure, unshakable resolve. He stood up straighter, and for the first time, he seemed to fill the room, his presence dwarfing theirs. "I'm not choosing," he said, his voice quiet, yet it carried the finality of a rock slide. The council members shifted, exchanging confused, irritated glances. "What do you mean? You're not choosing?" the sheriff demanded. "You have to?" "No," Rhett said. "I don't." He looked each of them in the eye, one by one, his gaze as hard and unforgiving as the land he lived on. He let his eyes rest last on Father Michael. "You talk about my home. You haven't seen my home. You don't know the first thing about it." He turned to the door, and then paused, his hand on the latch. He looked back at the 5 men who had presumed to judge him. "I will not choose one," he said, his voice ringing with a power that stunned them into silence. "Because they are both my home." He walked out, leaving a wake of sputtering indignation. He did not look back. He rode out of redemption with his head held high, the town's judgment a useless weight that slid off his shoulders. He had spoken his truth. He had defended his family. He felt a sense of clean, defiant peace. But he knew, with a cold certainty that chilled his bones, that it was not over. Men like that, their authority challenged, their rigid world questioned, did not simply let things be. The attack came 3 nights later. It was a moonless, starless night, the darkness outside the windows an absolute, impenetrable black. They had gone to bed exhausted from another long day of work. The house settled into a comfortable, sleeping silence. It was the smell that woke Rhett first, the acrid, biting scent of smoke. In the same instant, he heard the frantic whinnying of the horses in the barn. He was out of bed in a second, his soldier's instinct screaming. He threw open his door and was met with a wall of heat and the terrifying crackle of hungry flames. The front of the house was already an inferno. "Fire!" he roared, his voice ripping through the quiet. "Evelyn! Clara! Get out!" He didn't wait for an answer, instead running toward the back of the house, toward their rooms. Evelyn's door burst open and she stumbled out, her face a mask of terror in the flickering orange light, coughing from the smoke that was now thick and choking. "Clara!" she gasped, pointing toward the small room behind the kitchen. The fire was moving with unnatural speed, racing along the dry, seasoned logs of the old house. Rhett knew, with a sick certainty, that this was no accident. Kerosene. Someone had thrown it against the front of the house. He kicked open the door to Clara's room. She was huddled by the small window, trying to pry it open, her movements frantic and panicked. The room was already filling with black smoke. "The window's stuck!" she cried, her voice thin with terror. "Get down," Rhett commanded. He wrapped an arm around Evelyn, pushing her toward the floor where the air was cleaner. He grabbed the small washstand and, with a surge of adrenaline, hurled it through the window. Glass shattered, and a rush of night air, blessedly clean, poured into the room. "Evelyn, you first," he ordered. He helped her scramble through the broken window, then turned back for Clara. She was coughing violently now, her body racked with spasms. He scooped her up, she felt as light as a child, and carried her through the opening, dropping to the ground outside just as the roof of the kitchen gave way with a deafening roar, sending a shower of embers and flaming debris into the night sky. They stumbled away from the house, the heat scorching their skin, the roar of the fire a physical blow. They stood in the yard, 3 small figures silhouetted against a pillar of fire, and watched their home burn. Everything. The sturdy logs Rhett's father had hewn, the quilt his mother had made, Evelyn's letters, Clara's few pathetic belongings, every small thing that had constituted their world, was being consumed. The fire was a ravenous beast, devouring their past and their future, leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the dust at their feet. The barn, thank God, was untouched, the wind carrying the flames away from it. The animals were safe, but the house, their sanctuary, was gone. As the last wall collapsed into the heart of the fire, the adrenaline that had kept Clara on her feet gave out. A terrible, shuddering cough tore through her, and she crumpled to the ground, her body convulsing. The smoke inhalation, combined with the shock and the lingering weakness from her last illness, was too much. Rhett was at her side instantly. He felt her forehead. She was already burning with fever. Her breathing was a ragged, shallow rasp. "We need to get her to the barn," Evelyn said, her voice shaking but steady. She had already taken charge, her own terror pushed aside by the immediate, desperate need. They carried Clara to the barn and made a bed for her in the clean hay of the loft. The night was a long, terrible vigil. Clara's fever raged, and she drifted in and out of a coughing, delirious state. They had no medicine, no supplies, nothing. Evelyn bathed her face with cool water from the stock trough, her movements gentle and efficient, her face a pale, determined mask in the lantern light. Rhett could only stand by, helpless and consumed by a cold, murderous rage at the faceless cowards who had done this. By dawn, Clara was worse. Her breath came in short, painful gasps, a wet, rattling sound in her chest. "It's her lungs," Rhett said, his voice raw. "The smoke. She needs a doctor. The nearest is in Stone Creek," Evelyn said, her eyes never leaving Clara's face. "That's 2 days' ride, if I push the horse to its limit," Rhett finished. It was a desperate gamble. Clara might not have 2 days, but it was the only chance they had. "I'll stay with her," Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. Rhett looked at the 2 women, one unconscious, the other unwavering, and his heart felt like it was being torn in 2. He squeezed Evelyn's shoulder, a silent message of trust and gratitude, saddled Pilgrim with trembling hands, and rode out into the gray, desolate dawn, leaving them alone with the smoking ruins of their home. For 2 days and 2 nights, Evelyn did not sleep. She tended to Clara with a fierce, desperate devotion. She coaxed sips of water between her cracked lips. She cooled her skin. She held her hand and spoke to her in a low, soothing voice, telling her stories of the sea in Boston, of the gulls crying over the harbor, anything to anchor her to the world of the living. On the second night, Clara's fever seemed to peak. In a moment of terrifying lucidity, her eyes, glassy and dark, focused on Evelyn. She tried to speak, her voice a dry, rasping whisper. "Evelyn." "I'm here, Clara," Evelyn said, leaning close. "I'm right here. Just rest." Clara's fingers tightened weakly on Evelyn's hand. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "It's all right," she whispered, each word an enormous effort. You were meant to be here, not me." "Don't say that," Evelyn sobbed. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed now streaming down her face. "Don't you dare say that." "No, listen," Clara insisted, a flicker of her old strength returning. "If you're the one who stays with him, Love him enough for me, too. Love him enough for both of us." Her eyes fluttered closed, and her hand went limp in Evelyn's grasp. A cry of pure agony was torn from Evelyn's throat. "No!" she screamed into the empty barn. "No! I will not lose you! I won't!" She had lost her innocence. She had lost her child. She would not lose this. She would not lose the woman who had, against all odds, become the other half of her heart. She held Clara's limp body, rocking back and forth in the hay, her tears falling on Clara's still face, her voice a raw, broken litany of refusal against the encroaching darkness. Rhett returned late the next day, his face gray with exhaustion, his horse near collapse. He had found the doctor, an old, weary man who had agreed to come, but he wouldn't arrive for another day. Rhett slid from the saddle and staggered toward the barn, his heart pounding with dread. He found them in the loft, just as he had left them, but now Evelyn was slumped over Clara's body, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Clara was terrifyingly still. Rhett's world stopped. He thought he was too late. He climbed the ladder, his legs like lead, and knelt beside them. He reached out a trembling hand and touched Clara's neck. There was a pulse, faint, thready, but it was there. She was alive, barely. The relief was so immense, so overwhelming, that it broke him. The iron control he had maintained his entire adult life, through war and loss and loneliness, finally shattered into a million pieces. He gathered Clara's frail, unconscious body into his arms, holding her against his chest as if he could will his own strength into her. He looked at Evelyn, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes hollow with grief and exhaustion, and then at the woman dying in his arms, and he wept. He lowered his head and cried with great, shuddering, silent sobs, his tears falling onto Clara's pale face. He had been so proud, so self-sufficient, so determined to need no one, and he had been a fool. He held Clara tight and looked up through the hayloft door at the vast, indifferent, smoke-hazed sky. He didn't know who he was speaking to God, to the universe, to the spirits of the empty land. His voice, when it came, was a raw, broken whisper, a prayer torn from the very depths of his soul. "Please," he begged, the word a sound of pure anguish. "Don't take her. Don't take either of them." He clutched Clara tighter, his gaze finding Evelyn's through his tears. "I can't," he choked out, the confession wrenched from him. "I can't live without either one of you." The doctor arrived looking like a man made of dust and leather, his horse just as weary as Rhett's. He was an old man named Elias, with eyes that had seen too much of birth and death on the raw frontier to be shocked by anything. He didn't ask about the burned-out shell of the house or the three of them living in a barn. He simply took the small bag he carried, knelt in the hay beside Clara, and went to work. The hours that followed were a blur of hushed commands, the clink of glass bottles, and the sharp, clean scent of carbolic acid. Rhett and Evelyn became his nurses, following his instructions with a focused, desperate precision. They held Clara down during the worst of the coughing fits. They forced spoonfuls of bitter medicine between her lips, and they watched as the doctor's skilled hands seemed to fight a physical battle against the death that had settled in her lungs. Rhett's prayer had been a plea born of despair. The doctor's work was a grim, practical war. On the second day, after a long night when her breathing had become so shallow it was almost imperceptible, the fever broke. It did not vanish in a dramatic rush, but receded like a slow tide, leaving her pale, weak, and utterly exhausted, but alive. When she finally opened her eyes and they were clear, focusing first on Evelyn's tired face, then on Rhett's, a collective, unspoken breath of relief passed between the three of them. It was the first clean breath they had taken since the fire. Clara's recovery was a slow, deliberate process, mirroring the turning of the season. as autumn bled its last colors onto the plains and the first hard frosts silvered the dead grass. Her strength gradually returned. The barn was their world. They partitioned off corners with old blankets, creating a crude but functional home. They cooked over an open fire in the yard, their meals simple and shared from a single pot. The hardship, which should have broken them, instead fused them together. They were a self-contained unit, their lives revolving around the shared tasks of survival and healing. When Clara was finally strong enough to walk in the weak winter sun, her hand held steady by Evelyn's, they stood together and looked at the black, skeletal remains of the house. It was a grave marker for the life they had almost had. "We'll rebuild," Rhett said, his voice quiet but absolute. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, a promise. The work began as the ground thawed. Rhett took his axe and wagon into the hills, returning day after day with strong, straight logs of pine and cottonwood. The rhythmic thud of his axe echoed across the quiet land, a sound of creation, not destruction. He taught Evelyn and Clara how to peel the bark, how to notch the logs with an adze. Their hands, one pair soft and learning, the other small and calloused, grew strong and capable. This was not the desperate, frantic work of the drought. This was slow, intentional, and hopeful. Every log they placed was a defiance of the men who had tried to destroy them. They mixed mud and straw for the daubing with their bare feet, laughing as they slipped and slid, their faces smeared with dirt. The laughter was a new sound, a startling and beautiful thing in the quiet air. They were not just rebuilding a house. They were building a home from the ground up, on a foundation of their own making, cemented with their own sweat and shared purpose. Each beam they raised, each stone they set in the new hearth, was a vow. One afternoon, as they were working on the roof frame, a wagon appeared on the track leading to the ranch. A woman was driving it. They all stopped, a familiar tension seizing them. They expected a new confrontation, a fresh wave of judgment from the town. The wagon pulled to a halt, and a woman no older than 40, dressed in a widow's simple black, climbed down. It was Sarah Browder. Her husband, a miner, had been killed in a rockfall the year before. She was a quiet woman, largely ignored by the town, who understood the particular loneliness of being a woman left behind. She held a covered basket in her hands. She approached them hesitantly, her eyes taking in the half-built house and the three of them, covered in sawdust and mud. She didn't look at them with pity or curiosity, but with a quiet, knowing empathy. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice soft. "The town, they talk, but some of us, we don't listen to the loud voices." She held out the basket. "It's not much, just a fresh loaf of bread and some preserves. I thought you might have need of it." Evelyn was the first to move. She climbed down from the roof frame and walked to the woman, taking the basket from her hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Browder," she said, her voice thick with an emotion that surprised her. "Thank you." "Call me Sarah," the woman replied with a small, sad smile. She looked from Evelyn to Clara, and then to Rhett. "A home is a hard thing to lose, but it looks to me like you three know how to build a strong one." She paused, her gaze lingering on them. "Don't let them break you. What you have here, it's worth fighting for." She didn't stay long, but her visit was like the first rain after a long drought. It was a single drop of kindness in an ocean of condemnation, but it was enough. It was proof that they were not entirely alone. Sarah's visit was a turning point. She came again the next week, and the week after that, her quiet, stubborn support began to subtly shift the current of opinion in redemption, the story of the fire. First whispered as a righteous act of God, began to be re-examined. People saw Rhett in town, his face grim and determined, buying nails and glass. They saw the burns on his hands. They saw a man who refused to be broken, who was rebuilding his life from ashes. The narrative of sin and abomination began to give way to a grudging respect for their resilience. The gossip didn't die, but it changed. It lost its venom and became something more akin to a local legend, the strange, unbreakable family out on the Corrigan Ranch. People still didn't understand it, but they began to accept it. It was a part of the landscape now, like a peculiar rock formation or a gnarled old tree. When they saw the three of them working together, they no longer saw a scandal. They saw survival. By the time the first wildflowers of spring pushed their way through the soil, the new house was finished. It was smaller than the first one, and simpler, but it felt stronger, more honest. It was a house that had been built not just with wood and stone, but with love and sheer force of will. A small garden was already sprouting neat green rows, and the porch faced the setting sun. One perfect spring afternoon, when the air was sweet with the scent of new grass and the sky was a flawless, gentle blue, they held their ceremony. There was no priest in black robes, no legal documents, no pews filled with judging eyes. There was only the three of them, standing in the yard behind their new home. They wore their simple, clean work clothes. They had picked a handful of wildflowers and placed them in a jar on the porch rail. That was their only decoration. They stood in a small circle, the new house at their back, the vast, open prairie before them. Rhett spoke first, his voice rough with emotion as he looked from Evelyn to Clara. "I spent my whole life building walls to keep the world out," he said. "You two, you tore them down. This house is made of wood, but you are my home. I swear to protect this home, and both of you, with my life." Evelyn went next, taking both their hands. She looked at Clara. "I came here looking for a husband, but I found a sister." Then she looked at Rhett. "I came here looking for safety, but I found a strength I never knew I had. My promise is to honor the truth we have found together. Always." Finally, it was Clara's turn. Tears shone in her eyes, but her voice was clear and strong. She looked at Rhett, her heart full of a love that was both fierce and gentle. Then she turned to Evelyn, her best friend, her confidant, her other half. A small, wondrous smile touched her lips. "I once begged for a place to stay," she whispered, her voice full of the memory. "I was so desperate. I would have been grateful for a corner of the barn, but now I know. Love isn't a place you beg for, it's a home you dare to claim." They sealed their vows not with rings, but with an embrace, the three of them, holding each other in the warm spring sun. A single, indivisible unit. They were a family, defined not by law or tradition, but by the undeniable truth of their own hearts. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple, they stood together on the porch, watching the day end. They were not a perfect family, and their life would never be simple. They were three broken people who had somehow, against all odds, managed to make each other whole. Behind them stood the house they had built, its windows glowing with the reflected light of the sunset. Before them lay the endless plains, a future as wide and as open as the sky, and in the quiet space between them, there was a feeling of peace so profound and so complete. It could only be called happiness. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and say hello. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel for more tales from the frontier. We welcome you to share your thoughts.